The notification chimed with a crisp, digital finality. A $5,200 transfer to Julian Vance for Father's Day. Julian's reply was almost immediate, a text message that carried the weight of a long, weary sigh. He expressed his gratitude for the generous gift, adding that he wanted for nothing, except perhaps for Leo not to be interested in men. Leo read the message as his Uber crawled through the late afternoon traffic, a sardonic smile playing on his lips. Some people were just never satisfied. The penthouse door clicked shut behind him, the sound swallowed by the cavernous, minimalist space overlooking the glittering expanse of Central Park. Julian was waiting, his posture rigid. The slap was a sudden, sharp crack in the quiet air, a burst of violence that left Leo's cheeks stinging and hot. Julian's follow-up was a desperate clarification that even if Leo had to like men, he couldn't like him. Leo leaned in close, the scent of Julian's expensive cologne filling his senses, and breathed against the shell of his ear. He murmured a quiet question, asking why his so-called daddy was trembling in his embrace. He relieved Julian of his phone, his hand deliberately brushing against the firm muscle of his guardian's inner thigh through the fine wool of his trousers. The texture was smooth, the body beneath it tense as a coiled spring. A shiver coursed through Julian's frame. With deft movements, Leo accepted the $5,200 transaction, the number now glowing at the bottom of his own banking app. Julian squirmed, his voice a low growl demanding release. Leo responded by tightening the silk tie he'd selected from Julian's own collection, now bound around the older man's wrists. He gave a soft pat to Julian's rear, eliciting a frustrated hiss, then wrapped his arms securely around his waist. He whispered that his father should stay still, him that any more movement would have consequences later. With Julian's phone still in hand, he navigated to the contacts, his finger hovering over the entry for himself. The label "Problem Child" was deleted and replaced with "Lover." That looked much better. He feigned a gasp of surprise, wondering aloud how he could have possibly made such a slip-up, changing beloved son to lover. He set the phone aside and nuzzled his face, still smarting from the blow, against Julian's neck. He considered it fair compensation. The pain was real, a dull throb that radiated to his jaw. At the contact, Julian's struggling ceased. He turned his head, his eyes, dark with a complex storm of emotions, fixated on the reddening mark on Leo's face. A flicker of pain, his own pain, was visible there, an emotion Julian himself seemed unaware of. The sight was intoxicating. Even now, bound and furious on Leo's lap, Julian regretted the anger that had driven him to strike the young man he had raised. Even if it was a reaction to being ambushed with a forceful kiss the moment he'd walked in the door. Seeing that unguarded sorrow in Julian's gaze, Leo felt an overwhelming urge to kiss him senseless. And so he did. Julian's mouth opened to protest, to curse him, which only provided the perfect opportunity. Leo often thought his own audacity was a monster of Julian's own making. Just as Julian's anger was about to boil over again, Leo pulled back. He let his expression crumble, his eyes drooping as he summoned two perfectly timed tears, letting them fall where Julian could see them. He complained softly that his face hurt. Julian turned away, his voice stiff as he told him to stop pretending. Leo leaned in and stole another kiss. He admitted, then, that it was an act, but the tears were quite real. Not from pain, but from a profound, exhilarating satisfaction. Julian had asked him not to love him, a request Leo was entirely incapable of honoring. How could he, when the man was a paragon of success, with a reserved demeanor that was the exact blueprint of Leo's desires? Falling for him had been as simple as breathing. Simpler, in fact. The first time he saw him, he had forgotten to breathe at all. He was, in truth, just a kid Julian had taken in. Leo had been 8, Julian a mere 16, when he'd found him. Leo, ever the opportunist, had immediately clung to his leg and called him his brother. Julian, in a fit of what must have been adolescent grandiosity, had instructed him to call him Dad. Thinking of his future comfort and security, Leo hadn't hesitated, shouting the word with all the force his small lungs could muster. From that day on, Julian became his guardian, his dad. He had been cherished. Julian, knowing the hardships of his early life, had indulged his every whim. He'd once promised that since Leo had called him father, he would protect him for a lifetime. He wasn't the distant, polished man he was today. He was warmer, more present. But after college and the meteoric rise of his career, a cool maturity settled over him, transforming him into a remote, unattainable moon in a vast night sky, his light no longer shining exclusively on Leo. As Leo grew, his feelings for Julian clarified. He first dismissed it as a phase, even acquiring a boyfriend in his freshman year of college. When Julian found out he had, for the first time, unbuckled his belt, he nearly flayed him raw. Leo, defiant, had shouted through his tears that Julian could kill him and he'd still be gay, that his son was a queer. After the rage subsided, regret had washed over Julian. He gently laid Leo on his own bed and tended to his wounds. As his warm fingers worked the salve into Leo's skin, he'd spoken of philosophies and life lessons, explaining that Leo was too young to understand his own heart, that he needed to experience more of the world. Leo heard none of it. A different kind of heat was building inside him, a fire pooling low in his belly. He grew hard. Panic seized him. Terrified of being discovered, he'd ignored the searing pain in his backside, pulled on his pants, and fled. Julian, mistaking his flight for anger, never again tried to interfere with his relationships. But it was pointless. Leo couldn't even bring himself to kiss another boy. His mind was consumed with Julian. He realized then it wasn't that he liked men, he just liked Julian Vance. After their chaotic encounter, a flushed Julian had changed into a fresh suit, the buttons of his shirt done up to his throat, a picture of aristocratic grace that couldn't quite conceal his discomposure. A faint crimson mark on his wrist, a testament to Leo's handiwork with the tie, was the only flaw in his perfect facade. Leo watched him, a slow smile spreading across his face. Julian's features were classic, a strong nose and sculpted lips. Unable to resist, Leo wrapped his arms around him from behind, his fingers tracing the outline of the watch he himself had gifted Julian, a custom Patek Philippe. He rested his head on Julian's shoulder, his eyes fixed on the elegant line of his neck. His mouth went dry. He wanted to leave a mark there. Julian pushed his head away, his expression unreadable as he told him to get lost. Leo moved faster, catching his hand and pressing a series of small kisses over the red abrasion on his wrist, feeling the frantic pulse beneath the skin. Julian snatched his hand back, telling him he was disgusting, and raised it as if to strike him again. Leo instinctively presented his left cheek, the one he considered his better side. He knew, from hours of practice in the mirror, exactly how he must look from Julian's angle. Eyes downcast, pathetically wronged, the small mole on the tip of his nose trembling. He told Julian to go ahead and hit him if it would make him feel better. The swelling would go down in a day or two. The raised hand hovered, then fell. Julian let out an exasperated sigh, shot him a glare, and walked out without another word, leaving Leo to pout about his lack of a reward. He slept with the suit jacket Julian had discarded, waking in the afternoon to its lingering scent. Reluctantly, he took it downstairs to the housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, and ran into Julian's executive assistant, a man named Chun. Chun explained that Mr. Vance had forgotten some crucial files for a meeting. Leo immediately followed him out and slid into the passenger seat of his car. He informed the bewildered assistant that he was going to pick up Julian from work. Chun, after a moment's hesitation, simply nodded and drove. When Chen escorted him into the CEO's office, Julian was deeply engrossed in a report, not even looking up as he asked if the materials had arrived, stating that the meeting would commence in 5 minutes. The sound of his voice, a rich and resonant baritone, was enough to hold Leo captive. Leo leaned against the massive mahogany desk and handed over the folder, asking why Julian hadn't just sent him. Julian's gaze flickered up, registered him, and returned to the file. He countered by asking if Leo didn't have classes. Leo insisted he was free, adding a note of complaint that Julian never seemed to care about his schedule. Julian took the files and stood, reminding Leo not to touch anything on his desk as he left for the conference room. A short while later, a knock sounded. Chloe, Julian's chief of staff, peered in. She was beautiful, sharp, and young, and offered the young Mr. Vance coffee or tea. He requested plain water. When she returned with it, she lingered, steering the conversation toward Julian's personal tastes. It was clear she was interested in her boss. Leo saw her as a potential stepmother, a threat to be neutralized. He sipped his water, affecting a troubled expression. He sighed dramatically, remarking on Julian's handsome appearance before confiding that, in reality, he was impotent. He elaborated, sighing again as he recalled Julian's generally reserved nature, feeling that his slander wasn't entirely baseless. Chloe was aghast. Mr. Vance didn't seem the type. Leo leaned in conspiratorially, assuring her she'd been deceived. He pointed out that Julian was 30, and everyone knew that a man over 25 was practically 50. He added for good measure that not only was Julian gay, but he was exclusively a bottom. Chloe's jaw dropped. Before she could process the barrage of misinformation, the office door clicked open. Julian stood there, his face a thundercloud. His lips pressed into a thin, furious line. His gaze was fixed on Leo. Leo guiltily looked away as Julian's voice, cold as ice, cut through the air, asking Chloe if she had finished her work. She stammered an apology and fled. Leo pasted on a cheerful smile and approached Julian, complaining about the length of the meeting and how hungry he was. Julian's gaze remained glacial. He stated flatly that he hadn't asked Leo to wait and that he could eat by himself. After all, he added, his words dripping with sarcasm, he was old. He was no good. The last 3 words were spoken through clenched teeth. Leo's bravado faltered. He'd been caught. Julian then asked if he'd like to test that theory tonight. Leo, recovering, blinked innocently and said he'd always preferred older men. He was willing to make a little sacrifice. He was young, after all, he was good. He grabbed Julian's hand, pretending to wipe away non-existent tears, his eyes full of theatrical devotion. The corner of Julian's mouth twitched, utterly speechless at his audacity. In the end, Julian took him to dinner. Not out, but home, where he cooked himself. The setting on the penthouse terrace was absurdly romantic, flickering candlelight under a canopy of stars. But just as Leo offered him a piece of perfectly grilled steak, Julian's phone rang. He glanced at the offering, ignored it, and walked to the far end of the terrace to take the call, deliberately turning his back. Couldn't be good. Leo pulled out his own phone and activated the software linked to a sophisticated listening device hidden inside Julian's watch. The voice of Julian's mother was sharp and impatient. She was asking why Julian hadn't come to pick up Wendy from the airport, demanding he come to dinner at once. She dismissed his excuse about having something to do, scoffing at the idea that anything was more important than family, especially not babysitting that little stray. She asked if he hadn't had enough of raising him after all these years, if he was really planning to spend Father's Day with him, accusing him of having lost his mind. Julian didn't answer, taking a long drag from a cigarette and staring into the night. He finally acquiesced, saying he'd be there later. Wendy, Julian's childhood friend. The girl who used to pinch Leo's cheeks and call him Julian's little shadow. She was back to compete for Julian's affection. After hanging up, Julian dropped the half-smoked cigarette and ground it out with his shoe. He told Leo something had come up and he should eat and get to bed early. Leo, still seated, caught his arm as he reached for his jacket. He looked up, his expression meticulously crafted to be innocent and vulnerable, and asked if he would be coming back tonight. Julian paused, taken aback. It had been a long time since Leo had used that tone, that particular brand of manufactured helplessness. He assured him he would be back, asking what nonsense he was imagining now. He gently removed Leo's hand and, before leaving, repeated his instruction not to wait up. The lie hung in the air. Julian knew perfectly well that Leo couldn't sleep until he was home. After he was gone, the silence was oppressive. The warm summer breeze felt chilling. When the last trace of his presence had faded, Leo stood and walked to where Julian had been standing. He picked up the crushed cigarette but carefully wiped it clean with his sleeve and placed it between his lips, but didn't light it. He couldn't bear to smoke it. It would be placed in a sealed bag with the rest of his collection. Every small scrap of Julian Vance he had managed to hoard over the years, locked away in a secret box. He couldn't stop himself. He followed him. He wasn't sure if Julian sensed him, but just before entering the restaurant, Julian glanced back over his shoulder. Leo ducked behind a parked car just in time. He didn't dare go inside, instead finding a dark corner where he could wait, separated from Julian by a single wall. He activated the listening app again, but heard nothing. Couldn't be broken. He had personally designed and tested the device hundreds of times. It was built to last a century. He restarted the app. Still nothing. Or rather, not nothing. He could hear muffled sounds, but not Julian's voice. Anxiety began to prickle at him. He found a quieter spot and listened intently. He could make out a low, rumbling noise, like sound trapped in a small, enclosed space. Then he heard the voice of Julian's driver, Lee, telling someone on the phone he would be home late to celebrate Father's Day after dropping off Mr. Vance. The watch. Julian had taken it off. Why? What was there that Leo couldn't hear? Had things with Wendy progressed to the point of discussing marriage? Could Julian like her that much? Would he abandon him? No, he couldn't get married. Leo couldn't accept it. He scrambled to his feet, needing to escape the spiraling thoughts. He didn't remember how he got home. He collapsed onto Julian's bed, still fully clothed, his mind a chaotic fog. He buried his face in the pillows, desperately inhaling Julian's scent, the familiar aroma of sandalwood and clean linen that was his only anchor. Only when his lungs were full of it did he feel remotely human again. It was only 10 o'clock. Julian had been gone for 90 minutes that felt like 100 years. He opened their chat history, the last message still the fund transfer confirmation from that morning. His fingers trembled as he typed, "Julian, when are you coming home?" He wrote and deleted the message a dozen times. Julian hated clinginess. It was nearly midnight when Julian returned. He flicked on the lights, revealing Leo curled up on the edge of his bed, wide-eyed. The sudden brightness was blinding, but Leo didn't blink, his eyes red-rimmed and unfocused. Julian asked him what he was doing in his room instead of sleeping. He walked over, the scent of alcohol preceding him, and sat wearily on the bed beside him. He'd been drinking. The realization allowed Leo to finally draw a deep breath. As his senses returned, he tried to stand to get Julian some water, but his legs gave way. They had gone numb. Julian caught his arm. His voice thick but clear as he told him not to bother, he wasn't thirsty. He added that he was back, and that Leo should go to sleep. Leo remained frozen, explaining that his legs were numb. Julian clicked his tongue in mild irritation and gestured for him to come closer, offering to rub them for him. Leo obediently shuffled forward and stood before him. Julian pulled him down to sit, lifting Leo's calf onto his lap. His elegant fingers began to knead the muscle, the familiar watch still on his wrist, the red mark from the tie now faded to a pale pink. The tingling sensation was both a relief and a torment, making Leo crave the feeling of those hands in his hair. He asked who Julian had seen that night. "A friend," Julian replied. Leo pressed, asking if it was a man or a woman. Julian fell silent. He lowered Leo's leg and changed the subject, stating that it was late and he should go to bed. Leo pouted and walked to the door, looking back every few steps. Later that night, unable to sleep, Leo turned on the listening app again, hoping the sound of Julian's breathing would soothe him. Instead, he heard something that made his own breath catch in his throat. A muffled, sleep-slurred voice. Julian's voice. "Leo, stay away from me. Leo, I love you." The quiet of the night was shattered. Only the frantic thudding of his own heart and Julian's soft murmurs remained. He had said he loved him. At 2 a.m, Leo slipped into Julian's room. Julian never locked his door, a habit formed from years of a small, frightened Leo sneaking into his bed after nightmares. Now that Leo was grown, such behavior would only get him thrown back into his own room. Moonlight filtered through the curtains, enough to trace the form of the man on the bed. His chest rising and falling in a slow, uneven rhythm that brought a strange sense of peace to Leo's troubled heart. He leaned down and placed a reverent kiss on Julian's forehead. But a voice inside him screamed that it wasn't enough. He had been patient for so long. He was on the verge of madness. His lips traveled downwards, over the bridge of his nose, until they met the mouth he had coveted for years. He could no longer hold back. His tongue traced the seam of Julian's lips, seeking entry. Suddenly, he felt a sharp pain as teeth clamped down on his tongue, drawing blood. Julian's eyes were open, watching him. In the light of day, Leo could use any number of brazen excuses to justify his actions. But the night was different. It was a shroud for human desire, a catalyst for emotional explosions. The darkness made one clearer. He expected a slap, a furious tirade. But Julian did nothing. He simply sat up, his gaze steady and silent. He was waiting for an explanation. Perhaps he was even hoping Leo would make a crude joke and brush the whole thing off, preserving their fragile status quo. But Leo couldn't speak. He didn't want to pretend anymore. He no longer wanted to be the nameless, placeless thing in Julian's life. He didn't want to be his damn ward. He wanted to be his. Julian finally spoke, his voice low. He told him to go back to his room. Leo's own voice was a whisper. "Julian, I love you." A flicker of shock crossed Julian's face before his mask of indifference slipped back into place. He yawned, a deliberate act of dismissal. "He knew," he said, patting Leo's arm. "Dad loved him too. Now go to sleep." Leo took Julian's hand away from his mouth and held his gaze for a long moment. Julian continued to play dumb, his expression one of pure, innocent confusion. Fine. If he wanted to pretend, Leo would force the truth. He grabbed Julian's wrist, pulled him close, and crushed their mouths together. Julian's pupils dilated, his breath hitched. He tried to speak, to curse him, which only granted Leo deeper access. He warned him not to bite, telling him it would only make him more excited. He deepened the kiss, losing himself in the faint taste of wine and Julian. Julian's cheeks flushed, his eyes fluttering closed as he seemed to surrender to the assault. Seeing him so affected, so vulnerable, calmed the frantic desperation in Leo's own chest. He pulled back, breathing hard, and gently caressed Julian's swollen lower lip. Julian slapped his hand away, his eyes snapping open to glare at him. He called him an animal and ordered him back to his room. But Leo's attention was drawn downward, to the unmistakable evidence of Julian's arousal beneath the silk pajamas. Before he could comment, Julian kicked him off the bed and pulled the duvet over himself. He insisted it was a normal biological reaction, something that would happen with any man. Leo, now kneeling on the floor beside the bed, met his gaze, their foreheads almost touching. He declared his own loyalty, stating that for him, it would only ever happen with Julian. A triumphant smile on his face, he returned to his own room. Julian's flustered, aroused image burned into his mind. He was affected, but he was still resisting. It was maddening. If Julian wouldn't accept him, then he would simply have to press closer. The next morning, Leo prepared breakfast. Julian emerged from his room looking utterly astonished to find him in the kitchen. but he sat down and began to eat the rubbery eggs without comment, his attention fixed on his phone as he messaged his assistant. Julian had always insisted on a no-phones-at-the-table rule. Leo, after swallowing a piece of what felt like a tire, took Julian's plate away, declaring it inedible. He began to say something about the previous night, but Julian cut him off, abruptly standing and adjusting his perfectly knotted tie. He told him not to overthink things and to focus on his graduate studies. He was leaving for work. He was late. He glanced at his watch and saw it was only 7 a.m. An awkward flush crept up his neck as he mumbled something about an early board meeting and fled. Leo couldn't help but laugh. All he had been about to say was that he'd been up all night cooking. Since he'd already been accepted into his master's program, he had time on his hands. He decided to visit Julian at the office. He sauntered into the executive suite to find it empty. Strange. Maybe there really was an early meeting. He settled into Julian's enormous leather chair, enjoying the view and the feeling of power, when the door opened. A woman's voice, unfamiliar and sharp, filled the room. "Why not? Because of that little son of yours?" The woman, Wendy, and Julian entered, stopping short when they saw him. 6 eyes met in a silent, awkward standoff. Wendy recovered first, her high heels clicking on the marble floor as she approached, her hand reaching out to pinch his cheek as she had when he was a child. He recoiled. Unfazed, she patted his shoulder, remarking on how tall he'd grown, even taller than his father. It was a clumsy, meaningless compliment that grated on his nerves. Julian rubbed his temples, his voice strained. He asked why Leo wasn't in class. Leo reminded him he had secured his graduate placement, adding a pained note about how little attention Julian paid him. Wendy interjected that Julian knew perfectly well that he had been bragging about it to her just that morning. Julian cleared his throat uncomfortably. After Wendy left, Leo immediately recalled her initial question. What was it that Julian couldn't do because of him? Julian, already engrossed in his work again, gave a non-committal hum. Leo pressed him, but Julian merely said it was nothing, clearly unwilling to discuss it. Leo felt a surge of frustration. Julian was always hiding things from him. He grabbed Julian's arm, forcing the man to look at him, and asked in a small, wounded voice if he was planning on finding him a stepmother. Julian's silence was answer enough. Leo's anger flared. He accused Julian of breaking his promise, the one where he said Leo would always be the most important thing. He forbade him from finding a stepmother. Julian pulled his arm free. His voice was laced with a deep, profound weariness. He told Leo that he needed his own life, his own purpose. Leo shot back that Julian was his life, that anything to do with him was his purpose. Julian sighed, grabbing Leo by the collar and pulling him close. He pointed to himself, his voice raw. "Look at me. I'm your father. I'm 30 years old, and you're 22. Don't you think it's time you outgrew this? This imprinting?" The clinical term felt like a slap. All Leo could think was how close their lips were. As he leaned in, Julian's hand came up and shoved his head to the side. "You have something seriously wrong with you," Julian seethed. Leo touched his cheek where he'd been struck, a slow smile spreading across his face. He could still smell Julian's scent, a ghost of the contact. Julian stared, bewildered by his reaction. His hands clenched into helpless fists. He declared Leo a lost cause and ordered him out. Leo left willingly. The reward would come later. He was wandering aimlessly near Julian's office building when he saw them. Julian's mother and Wendy, seated at a cafe. His mother beckoned him over. His stomach clenched. He was afraid of her. He could act out with Julian, knowing he would always be forgiven. But Julian's mother was a different story. She had never wanted Julian to take him in. Dressed in an elegant Chanel suit, she exuded an air of quiet, unshakable authority. He approached their table and offered a polite greeting. She corrected him immediately, telling him not to call Wendy his sister for much longer. Soon enough, he'd be calling her his stepmother. The coffee he'd just sipped nearly came back up. He looked to Wendy for confirmation, but she avoided his gaze. Julian's mother then made her offer: a fully funded graduate program at any university in the world. Oxford, Harvard, his choice. It wasn't an opportunity. It was a banishment. He politely declined, explaining that he had already been accepted to a program in New York and had started his own small company. He no longer needed Julian's financial support. In fact, he was in a position to take care of him now. Her response was chilling. The greatest help he could be to Julian, she said, would be to stay far away from him. That evening, a gnawing anxiety consumed him. He kept imagining Julian abandoning him, and the thoughts grew darker, more desperate. He found himself browsing websites for restraints, for chains and locks. Was he really contemplating locking Julian away? Maybe Julian was right. Maybe he was sick. When Julian came home, he found Leo on the floor, lining a pair of sleek, modern ankle cuffs with soft velvet. Julian's composed facade shattered, a flicker of genuine alarm in his eyes. He demanded to know what Leo was doing. Leo looked up, his work almost complete, and asked if he was going to marry Wendy. Julian's frown deepened as he asked who told him that. A bitter laugh escaped Leo's lips. So it was true. He forbade it. He told Julian that if he dared marry her, he would lock him up. "You're insane," Julian breathed. "Yes," Leo agreed, "I am." He tossed the cuffs aside and rose to his feet, backing Julian against the wall, trapping him. He stared into his guardian's eyes, searching for a trace of the desire he knew was there. He found only a reflection of himself. Eyes red, a cornered animal filled with desperation and grief. Julian's voice, when he spoke, was hoarse. He forbade the marriage. Not wanting to hear a denial, Leo captured his mouth in a bruising kiss. Julian struggled, but without any real force. Leo murmured against his lips that his softness was what had spoiled him so thoroughly. He deepened the kiss, trying to draw a response. Any response. But there was nothing. Julian remained passive, his eyes open and devoid of emotion, watching him with a look Leo knew all too well. It was the same look of weary indulgence he wore whenever Leo tried to shock him with gossip or test his boundaries. It was a look that screamed one word: boring. The lack of response was more devastating than any rejection. He pulled back, his own eyes burning with unshed tears, and demanded to know why. He knew Julian was affected. He knew he liked him. So why wouldn't he give him anything? Julian's reply was cold and detached. He claimed it was a normal physical reaction, that he would have it with anyone. That was impossible. Leo, his voice cracking, asked him why he continued to wear the bugged watch, why he tolerated his advances if he didn't care. He knew Julian was attracted to men, so why couldn't it be him? "Leo, I am your father." "You are not." The words were out before Leo could stop them, sharp and cruel. "I don't have a father who would have these thoughts about his son." The impact was immediate. Julian flinched as if struck, the color draining from his face. The light in his eyes dimmed, and his mouth trembled. Seeing the raw hurt on his face, Leo was swamped with regret. What had he done? He reached for Julian's hand, trying to pull it to his cheek in a familiar gesture of apology. But Julian snatched it back, his eyes now cold and empty of any affection. He asked what Leo wanted from him. "I love you," Leo sobbed, the words tearing from his throat. "I just love you." But his tears had lost their power. Julian turned his head, refusing to look at him. "Yes," he said, his voice flat and final. "I'm getting married." The words struck Leo like a physical blow. The tears he'd been holding back broke free in a torrent. He clung to Julian, begging him not to do this, not to leave him. Julian insisted no one was leaving him, but that their age difference, the fact that the world knew him as Leo's father, made a relationship impossible. He tried to reason with him, but Leo just shook his head, burying his face in Julian's neck. The familiar sent his only solace. He sobbed that all he understood was that Julian was choosing someone else, that he couldn't live without him. He bit down, hard, on the soft flesh of Julian's neck, a desperate, primitive attempt to mark him as his own. Julian hissed in pain, but finally, his hand came up to stroke Leo's back in a soothing gesture. After a long moment, he spoke, his voice heavy with resignation. "Go ahead. Bite. If it makes you feel better. I will never abandon you." The next morning, Leo sought out Wendy. He had to know the truth. If they were in love, he would step aside. Wendy, looking uncomfortable, eventually told him everything. Julian was trapped by his own conscience. He couldn't get past the father label, the 8-year age gap. He was convinced Leo's feelings were a form of youthful infatuation, a chick imprinting on the first person who had shown him kindness. When Leo asked if Julian loved him, Wendy almost laughed. She confirmed that he loved him so much it was destroying him. The marriage was a business arrangement, a concession to his mother and a desperate attempt to create distance, to protect Leo from his own corrupting feelings and the inevitable social stigma. She told him about driving a drunk Julian home one night. He talked about a kid waiting for him at home, and when she'd asked why they weren't together, he'd fallen silent, finally admitting he felt he had ruined Leo, that the boy hadn't seen enough of the world to make a real choice. Wendy concluded by saying Julian had already texted her that morning to apologize and call off the arrangement. She was never going to marry him. Leo was stunned. The very foundation of their bond, the word dad, was also the wall that kept them apart. All this time, while Leo had been pushing and prodding, Julian had been drowning in a silent, internal struggle. It was time for a new approach. He stopped going to Julian's office. He poured all his energy into his startup, leaving early and coming home late. At first, Julian seemed relieved by his newfound maturity. Then, he started asking indirect questions about Leo's life, about his work. Leo saw him a few times, waiting in his car across the street from Julian's building, watching the exhaustion etched on his face, his heart aching. He persevered until his small company landed a partnership with Julian's firm. The day they signed the contract, Julian looked at him with a mixture of shock and profound pride. For the first time, Leo felt like an equal, someone worthy of standing by his side. He organized a dinner party and invited everyone who knew the nature of their relationship. There, he made a formal announcement. Since there was no official adoption on file, their guardian-ward relationship, he declared, was dissolved. It took only a few sentences to sever the ties of a lifetime. Julian was visibly shaken, his throat working convulsively, but he said nothing. His mother, however, voiced her approval for him. Leo, giddy with a private sense of victory, drank heavily. So did Julian. Murmurs rippled through the room, people calling him an ungrateful brat, a user who had abandoned his benefactor the moment he had a taste of success. He ignored them, lost in the joyful thought that he was finally free to pursue Julian properly. Then a shout. Commotion. Julian had thrown a punch. He was beating a man, the one who had called Leo a wolf in sheep's clothing. His face contorted with a rare and terrible rage. He snarled that the man should keep his filthy mouth shut, that Leo had earned everything he had, and that whether it was worth it or not was his decision to make, not for gossips to debate. The room was silent. No one had ever seen the cool, unflappable Julian Vance lose control like this. Julian grabbed Leo's hand and stalked out. In the car, with a hired driver, the silence was thick and heavy. He stared out the window, his jaw tight. When they got home, he went straight upstairs without a word, but not before Leo caught a glimpse of the deep sadness in his eyes. Leo brought him a drink to sober up. Julian kept his eyes closed, pretending to be asleep. Leo lay down on the bed beside him, inhaling the scent of sandalwood and wine that felt like home. He rested a hand on Julian's waist. The man flinched but didn't open his eyes. Leo asked him softly if he wasn't even going to ask why he'd dissolved their relationship. That broke through his defenses. He sat up, his voice laced with hurt. What does it matter to me? I love you. Julian's breath hitched. I said, I love you. Now can you accept me? Before Julian could form a reply, Leo silenced him, his eyes locking with his. We have no relationship now, he said, slowly and deliberately. Can you love me now? Julian's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Leo told him to close his eyes. He said that if Julian was willing to love him, he should kiss him. Then he closed his own eyes and waited, his heart hammering against his ribs. The seconds stretched into an eternity. A sudden thud made him open his eyes. Julian hadn't fallen. He had simply collapsed back onto the pillow, fast asleep. A wave of amused frustration washed over Leo. He leaned down and placed a soft kiss on the corner of Julian's mouth. I'll answer for you, then, he whispered. Good night, Julian. I'll love you even if you don't love me. After he left, a single tear traced a path from the corner of the sleeping man's eye. The next morning, while packing for a business trip, Leo remembered the ankle cuffs he'd bought. He searched his room, but they were gone. His secret box of Julian memorabilia also looked like it had been moved. Julian appeared in the doorway and asked what he was looking for. Leo told him about the missing items. A strange look crossed Julian's face, but he quickly masked it, suggesting a mouse might have taken them. He asked why Leo wanted them, a hint of suspicion in his voice, wondering if he was still planning to lock him up. A new idea bloomed in Leo's mind. He agreed that it was an excellent thought. Julian's ears turned a shade of pink as he sputtered a denial, asking who would ever be excited by such a thing, calling Leo a pervert. Leo just smiled. He was a pervert and he was excited, but somehow he sensed Julian was too. He began his courtship in earnest. He picked Julian up from work, sent flowers, told him he loved him every day, and stole kisses whenever he could. Julian never gave him a formal title, but Leo was young. He could wait. Can you kiss me today? No. Fine. Then I'll kiss you. How about today? Can I have a kiss from my dear Julian? Call me Dad. No. Today is my birthday. Can I have a kiss as a present? No. Make a wish. Okay. I wish I could get a birthday kiss from my daddy. Before the words were even fully out of his mouth, a pair of warm, trembling lips pressed against his. Leo kept his eyes squeezed shut, fighting back tears of joy as he savored the feeling of Julian's love, a feeling he no longer needed to wish for. His wish had already come true.